You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello again. It's been another year, and this time I think I'm going to try something a little different. This is a podcast retrospective, where I talk about the podcast, the past, the future. This doesn't contain any actual history stuff, so if you don't really care about how the podcast runs or where we've been or where we're going, feel free to skip this one. This is almost just here for me and for people who care, so I'm not going to be upset if you do. The end of the year is always a good time to sort of look behind and look ahead. So in this episode, I'm going to sort of talk about that. It's grown far longer than I expected it to when I started writing this. But I think some of it's interesting, if at least to me. One of the first thoughts I had when I started writing this and sort of looking back at the last year is that I actually came pretty close to sticking to an episode list that I posted on the Patreon page back in February, other than the fact that Versailles sort of expanded beyond all reason. One very obvious feature of this year's episodes were some very long-running sort of sets of episodes, both for the Spring Offensives and for the 100 Days, which both ran 9 episodes, but also for the Middle East, which had 6 full episodes. For these long-running sets, I find that they are both easier for me to execute on, while at the same time turning into a bit of a slog during the creation process. I end up going over the information in each episode multiple times: research, organize, outline, script, record, rinse, repeat. And this means that when I do a lengthy series of episodes on the same topic, I get a bit fatigued because I'm just doing the same thing over and over again. This year sort of turned into the same 1916 problem all over again. Back in 2016, by the time I finished up the Psalm episodes, I was pretty ready to think about anything other than the Western Front. For some topics, there are ways to mitigate this problem, but for these large offensives, there's not much tactical maneuverability that I have. One of the reasons that I went with a topical instead of a sequential organization scheme for Versailles was simply to avoid this problem. Hopefully by handling each topic separately, I'm both more excited for episode 14 and 15, and it's easier for listeners to keep track of things instead of having to remember information that was from months ago. On the complete other end of the spectrum, I'm still really happy with how the Passchendaele episode came together. It was a very lengthy episode, but it was fun to do something in such a different format. I get questions sometimes about doing something like that again, and while it's an interesting idea, the amount of work required would basically mean forfeiting the, mostly, weekly schedule of the show, which I'm concerned would reduce listenership, which is something I'm trying to grow. I may still at some point in the future have another one of those up my sleeve. Look forward to that in the future, maybe. On the Patreon episode front, it was a very interesting year because I was working through topics that I knew absolutely nothing about. I knew basically nothing about the medical side of the war, and those 4 episodes were really my first exposure to the topic. The Czech Legion was a topic that I just sort of ran into while researching the Russian Revolution back in 2017, and the story was just crazy enough that I knew I wanted to learn more. There will actually probably be a part 3 released at some point on the Czech Legion, because I think there is more information that I need to get to incorporate into that story that I found during my Russian Revolution research for 2019. Finally, East Africa was a theater of the war that I had never read a single word about, but I chose to really dig in, and it was a really cool thing. And it was actually it was one of those things kind of for the first time where I feel like I had something to say about the topic. There were a lot of myths sort of built up around the East Africa theater, the German commander, Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, obviously being a big part of that. And that was a sort of a way for me to stretch my muscles in terms of actually saying something to really combat some very specific myths built up around his actions. We'll get to myths a lot this year at the end of the Versailles episodes. While a lot of things this year went right, I did have some plans for this year that did not end up happening. Almost all of them were based around expanding the podcast outside of its current format. The 2 largest of these plans were around book reviews and interviews. For the reviews part, I honestly just found it hard to dedicate the time to it. I'm already reading a ton of stuff for the show, but I find it challenging to read books for research and for review at the same time. Just the process of reading ends up being quite different for me. When I'm researching, I may read one chapter now and then the next a month from now. And trying to work that cadence in with a book review is something I've just not been able to accomplish. I just don't really know how to do it. The second big thing I hope to do was interviews. Basically, there is a ton of administrative work that I have not been able to find time to do, and recording would be tough anyway because my recording windows are incredibly limited. I also think part of the problem is that I personally don't really like listening to interviews very much, so it's really hard for me to get super motivated to do them, and it also limits my ability to find my own sort of spin because I just don't have much exposure to them. One other small thing, most of you, almost guaranteed, did not even notice. I really reduced the social media presence of the show this year. I'm still unsure if it actually mattered at all. I was putting quite a bit of time into making sure the various social feeds got updated, and there just did not seem to be much return value on that time, so I just sort of stopped. You also probably noticed that I've kind of stopped mentioning them on the show as well, kind of for the same reason. I still post to Twitter pretty regularly, but for the most part, it's not really ads or promotions. It's just, kind of normal Twitter stuff. Finally, when talking about 2018, we got to talk about those ads. This year, I joined a podcast network, the Recorded History Podcast Network, as I'm sure you've heard. Along with that transition, I started running ads. Since that point, I have tried a few different things around the ads, when they run, how many run per episode, the types of ads. At this point, I would say the results are mixed. The goal was to maybe turn this podcast into something more, to fund future projects, at the very least cover the podcast bills, which it's doing just fine. And while at the same time I didn't want to be too annoying with the ads, I'm trying to find a balance. At this point, that first goal of just making sure that the podcast bills are paid seems pretty good. It's in a pretty good spot. But moving beyond that, paying any more of my bills is probably not happening anytime soon. That's fine. Basically, this paragraph functions as a call for feedback. How do you feel about these ads? How do you feel that I did in the last year? Not just with ads, but with the podcast in general. Send me an email. Now it's time to talk about the future, 2019, where no one has gone before, unless you believe in certain theories about time travel, in which case all of this has happened before and all of it will happen again. That's just sort of how it goes. I announced a few months ago that the show would be extending past the signing of the Versailles Treaty and into the post-war world. The goal of this expansion is to give some time to discuss the events that were caused, often directly, by the war. The endpoint for these various events obviously varies because they're all over the world, but the new end date for the show seems to be coalescing around 1923-ish. I think it will take me roughly a year to get to that date while covering all of the events that I wish to cover. A full list of probable events is this. So, the Russian Civil War, the Polish-Soviet War, the Finnish Civil War, the situation in the Baltic states, the Greco-Turkish War, the creation of modern Turkey, Egyptian Revolution, the Iraqi Revolt of 1920, just general issues with the Middle East, the Irish Civil War, and of course, the situation in Germany roughly up to the Ruhr Crisis in 1923. I did not have much exposure to a lot of these topics that you'll be hearing about in 2019. Before I actually started researching them. I mean, Finland had a civil war. Heading into unknown territory is actually really exciting for me, if perhaps a bit nerve-wracking. I also think that it will be largely unexplored territory for a lot of listeners as well. I know that most people who listen to the show had already heard of the Battle of the Somme, but did you know that the Polish victory on the outskirts of Warsaw in 1920, when the Bolsheviks came calling, was incredibly important? It's a really big deal. There will probably not be any long 10-episode series in 2019 either. Most of these topics will be 3 to 4 episodes in length. I also have a really special plan for episode 200. I'm going to warn everybody right now that it will not be for everyone, but I've never really looked forward to creating an episode as much as this one. The episode is a total vanity project, and I'm basically creating it just for me. is the one time where the two topics that I've probably spent the most time reading about in my entire life collide, and I plan to take full advantage of it. On the Patreon side, there's also a pretty good list of topics ready to go. The naval episodes that I keep promising to people are going to be pushed back again because there is a dreadnought-sized mountain of research to tackle, but I do have some interesting stuff for episodes in the coming months. First will be a two-parter on conscription in the British Empire. These episodes started out with me just looking at the attempts of the British to implement conscription in Ireland in 1918, which did not go well, and they sort of expanded out from there. Then there will be a single episode on the Austro-Hungarian fortress at Przemysl, and then French military evolution in the pre-war years, and finally the contributions of India to the war. The first two are driven almost entirely by some books that I picked up recently. The French episode will also sort of be interesting because it functions as sort of an addendum to the Doctrine episodes that I did for the Patreon feed in late 2017, only this time with an increased focus on the French side of things, which were not well covered in those earlier episodes. Then after those 3 episodes, I plan to start the naval discussion. I promise it will be worth the wait when it happens. I just have to read a few thousand more pages before I start. Another item on the list for 2019 is a trip to Dallas, Texas in January to give some presentations on the medical war. For podcast listeners, this is important because in late January you can expect 2 very lengthy episodes, both with a runtime of about 50 minutes, where I give a version of those presentations, obviously in audio-only format. The first one will focus on the overall medical care situation during the war. The second episode will focus specifically on neurosurgery and neurology before and during the conflict. The research for these episodes has been quite a trip. I cannot tell you how many times I've ended up wandering around the internet trying to find out something with a name like dichloramine T, what it is, what it does, and why anybody would put it in the human body. Anyway, those should be releasing the last 2 weeks of January. I hope you really like them. Finally, for those who may be wondering about post-2019 plans, I can honestly say I don't have a clue. At this point, after roughly December 25th, 2019, anything else is just off the map. And at that point, we gotta start looking out for monsters. So thank you for listening to this episode. If you have any questions, comments, thoughts, concerns about this episode, about any of the 2018 episodes, about any of the 2019 stuff I've talked about, let me know. History of the Great War at outlook.com, twitter.com/historygreatwar, facebook.com/history of the Great War, or if you want to talk to me and other listeners in a more synchronous format, there's a link in the episode notes to a Discord server that I set up where I talk to people about the podcast pretty often. So that's all. Thank you for listening. This podcast doesn't happen without all of you out there listening to this right now. So I hope you have a wonderful day or night or morning or whenever it is, wherever you are. Thank you.